So in terms of the design of this 2D project, I want to get started by sharing with you just kind of a simple design document. I kind of use these design documents, that term kind of loosely, because I use this as both a design document and a production document. So I'm working in Affinity Designer, which is very similar to Adobe Illustrator. I prefer to work in a vector format when designing content, especially for 2D games, and UI and UX type stuff, because it's scalable. So just kind of want to give you a quick tour of the document that I have set up here. Again, this is very similar to Illustrator using Affinity Designer, and it's essentially the same thing, but there's some advantages from a licensing standpoint to use Affinity, and I'm kind of a fan of Affinity Designer right now. So I just want to share with you my process of setting up a project. So uh, I tend to kind of come up with ideas and just kind of frame out the basic elements of a project here, and I've kind of listed the essential elements in this project. It's basically just a top-down 2D shooter. I want a basic health system, some obstacles and time permitting. We'll get into some basic AI that's a little predictive, has some different behaviors based on how we want the enemy to react. We'll talk a little bit about some different control schemes to set up, whether it's keyboard and mouse, game controller, and touch for a tablet. And then there's a few other things. So I kind of set up a design document and experimenting with kind of the basic look and feel for this prototype. I've also mocked up just some couple of resolution references here, and just want to point out that we have a 1080p layout here. So this is pretty typical for television screens. So if you're developing something for like Xbox, or if you're developing something for Xbox, this would be the typical format, unless you're developing for the Xbox X, in which case we're shooting for, or PlayStation 5 for that matter, we're shooting closer to 4K. And then there's an iPad Retina just for contrast in here. So maybe if we're designing for mobile, and we target kind of a middle of the road iPad, this would be the resolution of our game screen. And this will be important when we start designing for the gameplay experience and the UX, and try to figure out the appropriate size of some of the graphics. So I also have some square content here, and this would represent 128 pixel square, 256 pixel square, and 1024. And so if I want to create some background textures or some icons or the player graphic, I get a sense of how large one of these assets are relative to, let's see if I can actually select that. There we go. Relative to the size of the screen. So if I'm designing for a 1080p, it's a pretty standard HD, and I create my player at 128 pixels. Let's see, I got my selections are working against me here. So right now I have this little graphic here that represents what a 128 pixel graphic would look like on screen relative to this size. So just some basic guides here. We're not going to take a real deep dive into optimization, but we do want to get a sense of what we're designing for, so that we're not trying to pack too much information, visual information, into these graphics, or making sure that we don't have enough and that we're designing too small. So I've just have this here kind of as a reference. Each one of these are different artboards. You can do this again in pretty much any modern design environment, whether it's Photoshop or Illustrator, Affinity Designer or Affinity Photo. They'll all support artboards, and the advantage of an artboard is that you can kind of almost set up multi-page documents inside an environment, but you can set this up rather, if there are individual pages, they would all have to be set to the same size, but because they're different artboards, we can create them to pretty much any size that we want. So for example, I could start off by duplicating one of these artboards. So here's a 1020 P artboard that I can just duplicate, and I can use that to kind of riff on some basic ideas. I'm gonna delete all that stuff. Alternatively, I should be able to go in here if I can figure out where my little artboard is hiding in here. There we go. Okay, so in Affinity Designer, the artboard tool is hiding under here. I thought that was the selection tool for a moment. But you'll see that when I just kind of drag and drop, or excuse me, drag and create an artboard, I have a new artboard here. And it's showing me the width and the height, so I could plug that into, you know, any resolution that I want. There's also some presets that we can use. So most of this stuff, pretty much all this stuff, actually, I created on an iPad, which was really nice because the Affinity Designer supports like kind of the full design environment, and I can move back and forth. So, so I took it upon myself to force myself to move away from the Adobe suite this summer. So this is the first project I'm really spending some time in Affinity. So I have a basic design document. This is a living document. I'll continue to add features and document features that I'd like to experiment with. I have the resolution reference here, which will come in handy. And then I kind of broke elements out into a sprite sheet. So the sprite sheet is basically just a combination of all the graphics and all the different individual elements that I think I'm going to use. I have a duplicate more or less over here. I duplicated the artboard, and I'm continuing to kind of riff and change some of the design elements. You can see that I have a little meteor here. It's been different states of destruction. I'm going to see if that works out for me. So this is just kind of a workspace for now to kind of riff on some ideas, and if I get some designs I like or some elements, some special effects that I want to incorporate, I'll develop this into a second sprite sheet. And kind of same thing going on here. I started working on some basic UI elements. And then finally, I put together an artboard to start mocking up the basic gameplay. So I'm looking to see what the player would look like inside a basic environment. I'm starting to think about options for the UX, the user experience design. In really simple terms, from a mechanic standpoint, I basically just want to be able to fly this player around, avoid these obstacles that are going to be moving into the scene, potentially destroy the obstacles as well. And so that implies that, you know, if I have an obstacle that I want to avoid, I need a health system for the player. I need a simple health system for the obstacles. And then at some point I would like to introduce some of these bad guys here and introduce those into the environment. And I'll just kind of eyeball this and scale this down. So maybe we have a bad guy trying to fly around and teach our player a lesson here. So so the basic elements here is I want to be able to shoot some stuff, avoid getting shot, and kind of destroy some things on screen. If we can accomplish that, we have the core elements for a simple 2D game. And so that's just a really quick overview of all of these elements. Now, I'm going to export, well, I've already exported some of this content, but I'll just walk you through the process. You can do this again in pretty much any modern design application. I've selected all of the content on one of my artboards. I could export all the individual artboards, but I want to just kind of get this as a sample out into Unity where I can utilize these individual graphics. So if I were to choose File Export, and I'll export this as a PNG file, I'm just going to make sure that I'm not exporting the whole document. I just want to export the stuff that I have selected without any background, and I'll hit export. And for the sake of the demo, I'm going to go right to the desktop, and I'm just saving this as spaceship20.png. It's the same file name as the project I'm working on. And just to show you what that would look like, we can kind of imagine what this would look like. We have a simple PNG graphic with no background, so we have a transparency in the background, and we can isolate these individual elements inside Unity and use those as individual graphics. We'll talk about the advantages of that here in a short bit, but I'm going to close this for now, because alternatively what we can do, is rather than working in one big sprite sheet like that, we can select individual elements. So if I take this design for this player ship, and maybe I call that spaceship 1 or player 1, I could choose to export this element individually as a PNG, and I'll just make sure that it's the selection without background, so I'm not getting those white pixels in there, and I'll choose to export this, and I'm going to export this to the desktop again. I've already exported this stuff, but I'll call this spaceship P for player 01, so it's the player 1 spaceship, and I'll go look at the desktop here and pop this open, and you can see that I have this individual element. Okay, so that's just a really quick, maybe a not so quick rundown of sort of the thought process and you know, some of the elements that have gone into my design. So I'm really kind of thinking about this in a 2D space. I'm not even really thinking about the design of the game just yet inside Unity, but now I'll start mocking up the core mechanics to get this game playable. We'll start that in the next presentation.